So this letter is 3 years old. It's from Jane's uncle on her father's side, John Eyre, and he asks Mrs. Reed to send in the information for Jane because he'd like her to come live with him at Madeira, and he wants to adopt her because he is unmarried and has no child and wants to make her his heir, bequeath her at my death whatever I may have to leave. So adopt her, give her a place to live, and also give her a source of income and basically money. Why did I never hear of this? I asked. Because I disliked you too fixedly and thoroughly ever to lend a hand in lifting you to prosperity. I could not forget your conduct to me, Jane, the fury with which you once turned on me, the tone in which you declared you abhorred me the worst of anybody in the world, the unchildlike look and voice with which you affirmed that the very thought of me made you sick, and asserted that I had treated you with miserable cruelty. I could not forget my own sensations when you thus started up and poured out the venom of your mind. I felt fear as if an animal that I had struck or pushed had looked up at me with human eyes and cursed me in a man's voice. Bring me some water. Oh, make haste. So Mrs. Reed says that she never told Jane this information because she disliked her so much and so determinedly and fixedly that she didn't want to help Jane get to a place of prosperity, so financial benefits and security. And she is still very struck by Jane speaking to her before Jane left for Lowood. Jane yells at her and basically tells her that she's treated her horribly, that she's going to tell everyone how awful Mrs. Reed was, never call her aunt again. And Mrs. Reed has remembered that and held that against her, not taking into account that Jane was a child when that happened and that she was an adult. Dear Mrs. Reed, said I, as I offered her the draught she required, think no more of all this. Let it pass away from your mind. Forgive me for my passionate language. I was a child then. 8-9 years have passed since that day. She heeded nothing of what I said, but when she had tasted the water and drawn breath, she went on thus. I tell you I could not forget it, and I took my revenge. For you to be adopted by your uncle and placed in a state of ease and comfort was what I could not endure. I wrote to him. I said I was sorry for his disappointment, but Jane Eyre was dead. She had died of typhus fever at Lowood. Now act as you please. Write and contradict my assertion. Expose my falsehood as soon as you like. You were born, I think, to be my torment. My last hour is racked by the recollection of a deed which, but for you, I should never have been tempted to commit. So it gets worse, because now Mrs. Reed admits that instead of helping Jane, she told her uncle that Jane had died at Lowood of typhus fever. And Mrs. Reed says, now you can write to him and contradict me. And also blames Jane for her actions. She says, my last hour is racked by the recollection of a deed which, but for you, I should never have been tempted to commit. And says also that Jane is like the bane of her existence, that she's always tormented her, and that now, as she's dying, she's thinking of this wrong that she's done to Jane, which is definitely not Jane's fault. If you could but be persuaded to think no more of it, aunt, and to regard me with kindness and forgiveness. You have a very bad disposition, said she, and one to this day I feel it impossible to understand. How for 9 years you could be patient and quiescent under any treatment, and in the 10th break out all fire and violence, I can never comprehend. My disposition is not so bad as you think. I am passionate, but not vindictive. Many a time, as a little child, I should have been glad to love you if you would have let me, and I long earnestly to be reconciled to you now. Kiss me, aunt. I approached my cheek to her lips. She would not touch it. She said I oppressed her by leaning over the bed, and again demanded water. As I laid her down, for I raised her and supported her on my arm while she drank, I covered her ice-cold and clammy hand with mine. The feeble fingers shrank from my touch. The glazing eyes shunned my gaze. Love me then, or hate me, as you will, I said at last. You have my full and free forgiveness. Ask now for God's, and be at peace. Wow, so Jane doesn't get angry at any of that information, even the fact that she has been denied basically a fortune and a way of living from her other uncle, and also a relative who does seem to actually care about her. She asks Mrs. Reed to be reconciled to her. She tries to explain a little bit of her disposition, and Jane treats her with every kindness that she can possibly offer this woman, and still Mrs. Reed is cold and cruel towards her. And Jane says that she forgives Mrs. Reed, and Jane kind of says, love me or hate me as you love me then, or hate me as you will. So Jane is okay if Mrs. Reed can't forgive her, but she forgives Mrs. Reed. Poor suffering woman. It was too late for her to make now the effort to change her habitual frame of mind. Living, she had ever hated me. Dying, she must hate me still. The nurse now entered, and Bessie followed. I yet lingered half an hour longer, hoping to see some sign of amity, but she gave none. She was fast relapsing into stupor, nor did her mind again rally. At 12 o'clock that night she died. I was not present to close her eyes, nor were either of her daughters. They came to tell us the next morning that all was over. She was by that time laid out. Eliza and I went to look at her. Georgiana, who had burst out into loud weeping, said she dared not go. There was stretched Sarah Reed's once robust and active frame, rigid and still. Her eye of flint was covered with its cold lid. Her brow and strong traits bore yet the impress of her inexorable soul. A strange and solemn object was that corpse to me. I gazed on it with gloom and pain. Nothing soft, nothing sweet, nothing pitying, or hopeful, or subduing did it inspire. Only a grating anguish for her woes, not my loss, and a somber, tearless dismay at the fearfulness of death in such a form. Eliza surveyed her parent calmly. After a silence of some minutes, she observed, with her constitution, she should have lived to a good old age. Her life was shortened by trouble. And then a spasm constricted her mouth for an instant. As it passed away, she turned and left the room, and so did I. Neither of us had dropped a tear. So at the end of the chapter, Mrs. Reed passes away. Jane and Eliza go to see her. Georgiana is too upset to, allegedly, and Eliza says that her life was shortened by trouble. And Eliza looks for a minute like she's going to cry, but doesn't. And then Jane just does not cry at Mrs. Reed's death. But Jane has made peace with her aunt, even though Mrs. Reed was not able to make peace with her. Bear in mind that this same Jane in this chapter who forgives Mrs. Reed for what she's done is the same Jane who said that she would never call Mrs. Reed aunt, and who told Helen Burns that she could not understand why she should be nice to people who are not nice to her. This is clearly a character who's grown up and matured. And think about the fact, too, that this all happens at Gateshead, where Jane started out. So even though she's in the same setting, Jane has really transformed, although the place itself has not. And that's chapter 21.